Hi everyone, Kate back for another quarantine ghost story session. And the weather today, you can probably tell from the crummy lighting in this video, is very conducive to this. It is windy and rainy. It's coming and going, so it just kind of depends on the time how much rain we're getting. But I will be resuming the story of Salome from this collection of Victorian ghost stories. And I think we have about 4 pages left, but I felt like it was getting a bit long yesterday and wanted to wait until today to continue. So we shall continue. The sun was now just going down, had gone down indeed, behind a bank of golden-edged cumuli, and was flooding earth, sea, and sky with crimson. It was at this hour that I saw her. It was upon this spot that she was sitting. A few scant blades of grass had sprung up here and there upon the grave. Her dress must have touched them as she sat there. Her dress, perhaps her hand. I gathered one and laid it carefully between the leaves of my notebook. At last I turned to go, and turning, met her face to face. She was distant, about 6 yards, and advancing slowly towards the spot on which I was standing. Her head drooped slightly forward. Her hands were clasped together. Her eyes were fixed upon the ground. It was the attitude of a nun. Startled, confused, scarcely knowing what I did, I took off my hat and drew aside to let her pass. She looked up, hesitated, stood still, gazed at me with a strange, steadfast, mournful expression, then dropped her eyes again, passed me without another glance, and resumed her former place and attitude beside her father's grave. I turned away. I would have given worlds to speak to her, but I had not dared, and the opportunity was gone. Yet I might have spoken. She looked at me, looking at me with so strange and piteous an expression in her eyes, continued looking at me as long as one might have counted 5. I might have spoken. I surely might have spoken. And now, now it was impossible. She had fallen into the old thoughtful attitude, with her cheek resting on her hand. Her thoughts were far away. She had forgotten my very presence. I went back to the shore, more disturbed and uneasy than ever. I spent all the remaining daylight in rowing up and down the margin of the Lido, looking for her gondola, hoping, at all events, to see her put off, to follow her, perhaps, across the waste of waters. But the dusk came quickly on, and then darkness, and I left at last without having seen any further sign or token of her presence. Lying awake that night, tossing uneasily upon my bed, and thinking over the incidents of the last few days, I found myself perpetually recurring to that long, steady, sorrowful gaze which she fixed upon me in the cemetery. The more I thought of it, the more I seemed to feel that there was in it some deeper meaning than I, in my confusion, had observed at the time. It was such a strange look, a look almost of entreaty, of asking for help or sympathy, like the dumb appeal in the eyes of a sick animal. Could this really be? What, after all, more possible than that, left alone in the world, with perhaps not a single male relation to advise her, she found herself in some position of present difficulty, and knew not where to turn for help. All this might well be. She had even perhaps some instinctive feeling that she might trust me. Ah, if she would indeed trust me! I had hoped to receive my Paduan letter by the morning delivery, but morning and afternoon went as before, and still no letter came. As the day began to decline, I was again on my way to the Lido, this time for the purpose and with the intention of speaking to her. I landed and went direct to the cemetery. It had been a dull day. Lagoon and sky were both one leaden uniform gray, and a mist hung over Venice. I saw her from the moment I reached the upper ridge. She was walking slowly to and fro among the graves, like a stately shadow. I had felt confident somehow that she would be there, and now, for some reason that I could not have defined for my life, I felt equally confident that she expected me. Trembling and eager, yet half dreading the moment when she should discover my presence, I hastened on, printing the loose sand at every noiseless step. A few moments more, and I should overtake her, speak to her, hear the music of her voice, the music which I remembered so well, though a year had gone by since I had last heard it. But how should I address her? What had I to say? I knew not. I had no time to think. I could only hurry on till within some 10 feet of her trailing garments, stand still when she turned, and uncover her before her as if she were a queen. She paused and looked at me, just as she had paused and looked at me the evening before, with the same sorrowful meaning in her eyes, with even more than the same entreating expression. But she waited for me to speak. I did speak. I cannot recall what I said. I only know that I faltered something of an apology, mentioned that I had had the honor of meeting her before, many months ago, and, trying to say more, trying to express how thankfully and proudly I would devote myself to any service, however humble, however laborious, I failed both in voice and words and broke down utterly. Having come to a stop, I looked up and found her eyes still fixed upon me. "You are a Christian," she said. A trembling came upon me at the first sound of her voice. It was the same voice, distinct, melodious, scarce louder than a whisper, and yet it was not quite the same. There was a melancholy in the music, and if I may use a word which, after all, fails to express my meaning, a remoteness that fell upon my ear like the plaintive cadence in an autumnal wind. I bent my head and answered that I was. She pointed to the headstone of which I had taken a rubbing a day or two before. "A Christian soul lies there," she said, "laid in earth, without one Christian prayer, with Hebrew rites, in a Hebrew sanctuary. Will you, stranger, perform an act of piety towards the dead?" "The Signora has but to speak," I said. "All that she wishes shall be done. Read one prayer over this grave. Trace a cross upon this stone." "I will." She thanked me with a gesture, slightly bowed her head, drew her outer garment more closely around her, and moved away to a rising ground at some little distance. I was dismissed. I had no excuse for lingering, no right to prolong the interview, no business to remain there one moment longer, so I left her there, nor once looked back till I reached the last point from which I knew I should be able to see her. But when I turned for the last look, she was no longer in sight. I had resolved to speak to her, and this was the result. A stranger interview never surely fell to the lot of man. I had said nothing that I meant to say, had learnt nothing that I sought to know. With regard to her circumstances, her place of residence, her very name, I was no wiser than before, and yet I had, perhaps, no reason to be dissatisfied. She had honored me with her confidence, and entrusted me a task of some difficulty and importance. It now only remained for me to execute that task as thoroughly and quickly as possible. That done, I might fairly hope to win some place in her remembrance, by and by, perhaps in her esteem. Meanwhile, the old question rose again. Whose grave could it be? I had settled this matter so conclusively in my own mind from the first that I could scarcely believe even now that it was not her father's. Yet that he should have died a secret convert to Christianity was incredible. Whose grave could it be? A lover's? A Christian lover's? Alas, it might be. Or a sister's? In either of these cases, it was more than probable that Salome was herself a convert. But I had no time to waste in conjecture. I must act, and act promptly. I hastened back to Venice as fast as my gondolier could row me, and we went along. I promised myself that all her wishes should be carried out before she visited the spot again. To at once secure the services of a clergyman who would go with me to the Lido at early dawn, and there read some portion at least of the burial service, and at the same time to engage a stonemason to cut the cross, to have all done before she or anyone should have approached the place next day was my especial object, and that object I was resolved to carry out, though I had to search Venice through before I laid my head upon the pillow. I found my clergyman without difficulty. He was a young man occupying rooms in the same hotel and on the same floor as myself. I had met him each day at the table and conversed with him once or twice in the reading room. He was a North Countryman, had not long since taken orders, and was both gentlemanly and obliging. He promised in the readiest manner to do all that I required, and to breakfast with me at 6 the next morning in order that we might reach the cemetery by 8. To find my stonemason, however, was not so easy, and yet I went to work methodically enough. I began with a Venetian directory, then copied a list of stonemasons' names and addresses, then took a gondola of Deux Ramets and started upon my voyage of discovery. But a night's voyage of discovery among the intricate back canaletti of Venice is no very easy and no very safe enterprise. Narrow, tortuous, densely populated, often blocked by huge hay, wood, and provision barges, almost wholly unlighted, and so perplexingly alike that no mere novice in Venetian topography need ever hope to distinguish one from another. They baffle the very gondoliers and are a terra incognita to all but the dwellers therein. I succeeded, however, in finding 3 of the places entered on my list. At the first, I was told that the workman of whom I was in quest was working by the week somewhere over by Murano and would not be back again till Saturday night. At the second and third, I found the men at home, supping with their wives and children at the end of the day's work, but neither would consent to undertake my commission. One, after a whispered consultation with his son, declined reluctantly. The other told me plainly that he dared not do it, and that he did not believe I should find a stonemason in Venice who would be bolder than himself. The Jews, he said, were rich and powerful, no longer an oppressed people, no longer to be insulted even in Venice with impunity. To cut a Christian cross upon a Jewish headstone in the Jewish cemetery would be a sort of sacrilege, and punishable, no doubt, by the law. This sounded like truth, so finding that my rowers were by no means confident of their way, and that the Canaletti were dark as the catacombs, I prevailed upon the stonemason to sell me a small mallet and a couple of chisels, and made up my mind to commit the sacrilege myself. With this single exception, all was done next morning as I had planned to do. My new acquaintance breakfasted with me, accompanied me to the Lido, read such portions of the burial service as seemed proper to him, and then, having business in Venice, left me to my task. It was by no means an easy one. To a skilled hand it would have been, perhaps, the work of half an hour, but it was my first effort, and rude as the thing was, a mere grooved attempt at a Latin cross, about 2 inches and a half in length, cut close at the bottom of the stone, where it could be easily concealed by a little piling of sand. It took me nearly 4 hours to complete. While I was at work, the dull gray morning dew grew duller and grayer. A thick sea fog drove up from the Adriatic, and a low moaning wind came and went like the echo of a distant requiem. More than once I started, believing that she had surprised me there, fancying I saw the passing of a shadow, heard the rustling of a garment, the breathing of a sigh. But no, the mists and the moaning wind deceived me. I was alone. When at length I got back to my hotel, it was just 2 o'clock. The hall porter put a letter into my hand as I passed through. One glance at that crab superscription was enough. It was from Padua. I hastened to my room, tore open the envelope, and read these words. Caro Signore, the rubbing you send is neither ancient nor curious, as I fear you supposed it to be. Altro, it is of yesterday. It merely records that one Salome, the only and beloved child of a certain Isaac da Costa, died last autumn, on the 18th of October, aged 21 years, and that by the said Isaac da Costa, this monument is erected to the memory of her virtues and his grief. I pray you, caro signore, to receive the assurance of my sincere esteem. Niccolo Nicolai. Padua, April 27th, 1857. The letter dropped from my hand. I seemed to have read without understanding it. I picked it up, went through it again, word by word, sat down, rose up, took a turn across the room, felt confused, bewildered, incredulous. Could there be, then, 2 Salomes? Or was there some radical and extraordinary mistake? I hesitated. I knew not what to do. Should I go down to the Merceria and see whether the name of da Costa was known in the Quartier? Or find the registrar of births and deaths for the Jewish district? Or call upon the principal rabbi and learn from him who this second Salome had been, and in what degree of relationship she stood towards the Salome whom I knew? I decided upon the last course. The chief rabbi's address was easily obtained. He lived in an ancient house on the Giudecca, and there I found him, a grave, stately old man with a grizzled beard reaching nearly to his waist. I introduced myself and stated my business. I came to ask if he could give me any information respecting the late Salome da Costa, who died on the 18th of October last and was buried on the Lido. The rabbi replied that he had no doubt he could give me any information I desired, as he had known the lady personally and was the intimate friend of her father. Can you tell me, I asked, whether she had any dear friend or female relative of the same name, Salome? The rabbi shook his head. I think not, he said. I remember no other maiden of that name. Pardon me, but I know there was another, I replied. There was a very beautiful Salome living in the Merceria when I was last in Venice, just this time last year. Salome da Costa was very fair, said the rabbi, and she dwelt with her father in the Merceria. Since her death, he hath removed to the neighborhood of the Rialto. This Salome's father was a dealer in Oriental goods? I said hastily. Isaac da Costa is a dealer in Oriental goods, replied the old man very gently. We are speaking, my son, of the same persons. Impossible! He shook his head again. But she lives! I exclaimed, becoming greatly agitated. She lives! I have seen her. I have spoken to her. I saw her only last evening. Nay, he said compassionately, this is some dream. She of whom you speak is indeed no more. I saw her only last evening, I repeated. Where did you suppose you beheld her? On the Lido. On the Lido? And she spoke to me. I heard her voice, heard it as distinctly as I hear my own at this moment. The rabbi stroked his beard thoughtfully and looked at me. You think you heard her voice? He ejaculated. That is strange. What said she? I was about to answer. I checked myself. A sudden thought flashed upon me. I trembled from head to foot. Have you any reason for supposing that she died a Christian? I faltered. The old man started and changed color. That is a strange question, he stammered. Why do you ask it? Yes or no, I cried wildly. Yes or no? He frowned, looked down, hesitated. I admit, he said after a moment or two, I admit that I may have heard something tending that way. It may be that the maiden cherished some secret doubt, yet she was no professed Christian. Laid in earth without one Christian prayer, with Hebrew rites and a Hebrew sanctuary, I repeated to myself. But I marvel how you come to have heard of this, continued the rabbi. It was only known to her father and myself. Sir, I said solemnly, I know now that Salome da Costa is dead. I have seen her spirit thrice, haunting the spot where— My voice broke. I could not utter the words. Last evening at sunset, I resumed, was the third time, never doubting that I indeed beheld her in the flesh. I spoke to her. She answered me. She told me this. The rabbi covered his face with his hands and so remained for some time, lost in meditation. Young man, he said at length, your story is strange, and you bring strange evidence to bear upon it. It may be as you say. It may be that you are the dupe of some waking dream. I know not. He knew not, but I knew only too well. I knew now why she had appeared to me clothed with such unearthly beauty. I understood now that the look of dumb entreaty in her eyes, that tone of strange remoteness in her voice, the sweet soul could not rest amid the dust of its kinsfolk, unhouseled, unanointed, unannealed, lacking even one Christian prayer about its grave. And now, was it all over? Should I never see her more? Never, never. How I haunted the Lido at sunset for many a month, till spring had blossomed into autumn, and autumn had ripened into summer. How I wandered back to Venice year after year at the same season, while yet any vestige of that wild hope remained alive. How my heart has never throbbed, my pulse never leaped for the love of mortal woman since that time, are details into which I need not enter here. Enough that I watched and waited, but that her gracious spirit appeared to me no more. I wait still, but I watch no longer. I know now that our place of meeting will not be here. Thus concludes the story of Salome by Amelia B. Edwards. These Victorian ghost stories, they seem rather simple, and then you're going to be thinking on them afterwards. So that was a very intriguing premise. So the next story is The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth by Mrs. DeWint to Mrs. Montresor. Or the story is by Rhoda Broughton. And then it's a series of letters. So I think that will be fascinating. This does look kind of long. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, actually, no. This should be doable in one session. It's 8 pages. So I look forward to reading tomorrow. I hope you are enjoying these ghost stories, and I hope that you're just finding ways to entertain yourself while passing the time. That is just a very unusual time in our world. So I will be back for another video soon, and have a lovely day.